No Greater Love, Memories of Our Early Years and Life Together by Stan and Nellie, Our Wedding Day, April 5, 1947, An Englishman Abroad, the Memoirs of Stanley Robertshaw. The first 8 years there is a point in time and a place on earth where we must all first see light of day. If information given by my mother be correct, this was for me at Apsley Villa Nursing Home, Manningham, Bradford in the county of York, England. The date was February 15th, 1920, my father being Percy Robertshaw, my mother, Ida Walker Robertshaw. Since my powers of recollection do not go back before the age of about 3 or 4, I must rely upon the historians to say that my appearance came about 2 years after the First World War, in which my father served as a stretcher-bearer. Was wounded several times and was decorated for bravery in the field in action. It was also close to the general strike which hit the country about that time. King George V, the bearded, kindly, and respected monarch, and his Queen Mary were the occupants of the throne at what must have been the most prestigious period of the British Empire. Quite certainly they were the last monarchs to live out their lives on the throne with the empire still intact, at a time when the suggestion that the empire might shortly meet its demise would be laughed to scorn. Who thought then that within just over 2 decades Britain would be a second-rate power? The only home I knew up to the year 1928 was at 31 Unwin Place on the outer fringe of the city of Bradford in an area known as Daisy Hill. It was well named indeed. Well, do remember with nostalgia Robinson's farm opposite the end of Unwin Place across Smith Lane. A stone-built farm and home with the hayloft, the stone water trough for the cattle to satisfy their thirst, the flowers in the front garden and the green fields behind the farm covered with buttercups and daisies, fields separated by typical Yorkshire dry stone walls, built by craftsmen long since dead, fields of clover with sun and clouds working together to provide a moving pattern along with the wind in the long grass in a never-ending sequence of designs and rhythms. There were bright splashes of colour from the occasional poppies which threw up their heads in the field corners, the blue cornflowers which attracted the big bumblebees, which, in turn, attracted me to the point of catching them in my cap, blissfully ignorant that they could inflict miserable punishment on an unsuspecting little boy. Beyond the fields and the stone quarry, where the blue sky met the green of the grass, a new estate was developing, new houses of a type which to my young eyes seemed to be like palaces in comparison to the humble home where I lived. These were for the middle-class people considered to be a well-to-do, as the crows flew only a quarter mile away, yet in social status well beyond our reach. Number 31, Unwin Place, was indeed a humble home, yet in no way did this diminish the security I felt there. To those who have never seen a Yorkshire workingman's home of the 1920s, it may be hard to imagine. The average house was one of many, built in one long terrace, hence the term a terrace house, some were through terrace type having a back door as well as one a front door. The other type was known as a back-to-back, having only one entrance, the back wall of the house in the rear, also being the back wall of the house in front. To reach the house in the rear, one had to go through a passage from the street. The lavatory or toilet was through the passage away from the house and was used by both families, each taking turns in the cleaning and upkeep thereof. In wintertime, candles were burned in glass jars to help keep the toilet from freezing up. Each house comprised a coal cellar, a small scullery at the head of the cellar steps consisting of a stone sink, cold water tap, one ring gas stand, most cooking being done on the fire, and room for a clothes wringer. There was one room which served as a dining room, living tomb, and also served as a bathroom on Friday night, a bath night, when a zinc portable bath was put in front of the fire. The one fireplace heated the room, supplemented the gas rings for cooking, and heated a boiler on one side of the fire and an oven on the other. To heat the water in the boiler meant to some extent taking heat from the room. Upstairs were 2 rooms, one bedroom and one half-bedroom, which was situated over the passage. The living room had a stone floor, and the bedroom steps and cellar steps also being stone contributed to some miserable wash days, Mondays, when the sheets and clothes were hung in that one room to dry. If there was one day in the week I hated, it was Monday. The house would be cold and damp, and one could hardly turn around without being assaulted by a piece of wash, which invariably would contrive to wrap itself around the nearest neck. Wash days which were warm enough to hang out were few and far between, the further outlook of the weather always seeming to be unsettled, in the parlance of the weathermen of later years. In these times, each day of the week was set apart for a specific task for the woman of the house. I do not remember just which days were for what, but one was for doing the baking of the week. It was not uncommon that mother should bake 7 pounds of bread on that day. 7 pounds made up of bread loaves, plain and currant tea cakes, and any small amount of dough left over was rolled out and placed on a baking sheet and made into fatty cakes, which Mum relished with butter, and which she alone could account for without help from anyone else in the family. I salivate at the thought of that wonderful newly baked bread. Thickened with butter, it was a meal in itself accompanied by nothing. Old bread was never wasted. Dry bread, not stale, was used for toasting. This was done on a roasting fork in front of a red fire. The person doing the toasting was usually toasted before the bread, having to change the fork from one hand to another until the job was done in order to avoid being burned by the hot coals. This was a favourite of my dad, who loved to eat it with fried cheese for his supper. In Yorkshire, a final meal taken just before retiring at night. The dough was mixed in a large earthenware bowl, then cut off in lumps and weighed on a beam scale before the pieces were put in loaf tins. These were then propped at an angle in front of the fire, covered with tea towels and left to rise before being put in the coal-heated oven. Tea cakes were laid out on oven sheets in a similar manner. Baking day was not complete unless a few jam tarts and lemon tarts finished off the session. Purchases were seldom made at the bakery. Bread was very much a staple. For breakfast, slices of bread dipped in hot bacon fat and spread with tomato ketchup were not uncommon. At other times, bread and butter with jam, and sometimes bread and butter and a piece of cheese with a stern parental admonition to take a big bite of bread and a little bite of cheese. Ironing took the biggest part of one day. As far as our family was concerned, electricity was not yet invented. Ironing was done with heavy cast irons. These were heated by standing them up on the rib of the fireplace facing the hot coals. 3 irons were kept on the go, 2 on the rib, whilst the other was in use, to be rotated as that one went cold. After the ironing, tea had to be prepared. Then following the tea-time meal, there were socks to darn and clothes to mend. For the British working class in those years, austerity was practised before the word was invented. Winter nights were long, cold and drab. The houses had no storm doors or storm windows, and when the house door was opened, the elements intruded with malevolent gusto. When the door was closed, it was done gently so that the gas mantle giving the only illumination did not disintegrate with shock. If condensation formed inside the gas pipes, it would cause the light to fluctuate from dim to bright continuously, a situation which tested one's patience to the limit. The gasman had to be sent for, no telephones, who would then come and stick a pin into the lead gas pipe at the lowest point and bleed out the water. The streets were illuminated by gas lamps, and I remember well the lamplighter coming each evening with a long pole with a flame on the end. This never failed to amaze me, since the light never blew out even in the strongest wind. Once a week he would come in daylight with bucket and wash leather to wash the glass lamp and change the mantles that may be broken. When he finished, they would really sparkle. On an evening, my father would sit in front of the fire, legs straight out with a roll of wallpaper resting on his feet. He would then re-roll the paper, inches at a time, all the while trimming the edge with long paper hanger's shears, getting his rolls ready for the following day's work. One afternoon a week would be devoted to a visit to Park Street, Shipley, to see Grandma Walker, a wonderful old lady who brought up a family of 5 girls and 5 boys, most of them at work at Salt's Mill, when Mother and Jay arrived. Around tea time things would liven up as one by one they would come home, hungry as hunters, the girls and the boys exchanging banter. The big perquisite for me was a spoonful of Uncle Jack's malt and cod liver oil on each visit. This was a universal fortifier for children against winter chills, and I could eat it by the spoonful. Coughs were treated by little lung healers, doctors being visited only in very dire circumstances, doctor bills being paid at 6pence a week, or what could be afforded. Saturday was clean-up day. The flagstones outside the house were swilled down with buckets of water and a stiff brush, After that, the stone steps were washed and the stone rubbed over with a yellow stone, then finished off on the edges by being rubbed with a white stone. These rubbing stones were soft and left their colour on the surface of the harder steps. Indoors, the fireplace and oven had to be black-leaded and polished. This was quite a large area and was hard physical work for a woman. A liquid was applied with rags and then polished with a soft bristle brush. Many times have I seen the sweat drip down from Mother's nose while brushing up the ironwork. Sweat came easier on wash day. The water had to be boiled in the fireplace boiler and ladled with a lading can into the galvanised wash tub, which stood on the room floor. The wash had to be opposta with a posser, a long stick with a tay-handle and 3 legs on the bottom. This was used to agitate the dirty clothes and was indeed manual labour. Although we were considered poor, we were not hungry, and I always thought well fed. Red meat on Sunday only. During the week dinners were cheap but good. Potatoes, cabbage, carrots, etc., and for meat, sausage, liver, oxtail as whim directed. On Sunday, the dessert most usually was a jello with custard sauce. A bottle of mineral water, soda pop, was indeed a treat and served, I would think, no more often than once a month, if that, and then only a partial glass each. My spending allowance was 1 penny a week, usually spent within 5 minutes of receiving it. My Saturday penny, without exception, was spent at Martha's corner shop, own a chocolate cream bar, no doubt laying an early foundation for the diabetic state, which became my lot in my late 50s. I cannot apologise for being a sweet tooth, as I take after my father. It was nothing for us to put 6 spoons of sugar in a pot of tea or cocoa and sneak an extra spoonful for the pot, if my mother chanced to glance the other way. Apart from my weekly penny, my mother would occasionally buy me a Comic Cuts or a Tiger Tim Children's comic paper. Until May of 1928, when I went with my family to live in the USA, Unwin Place was to be my own little world. Naturally, there were some excursions from it, most short, some on holiday, much longer. Childhood days in those years seemed as if they would continue forever. Life was simple, pleasures were simple, fears were terrifying, and as I understood later in life without foundation. Like the case of Miss Holmes, she was an elderly lady who lived on Unwin Place in the last house on the opposite side of the street. Her house abutted a high wall which blocked off the end of Unwin Place. One day I was told the old lady had died, my first encounter with death. My fear of it must have been instinctive, as I don't recall any discussions on the subject prior to that time. However, a day or 2 after her death, a bundle was propped up outside her house in the corner against the wall. This was her body. No one could convince me otherwise, but the sight of it absolutely terrified me, and it was a long time before I would venture near that end of the street. In looking back, it must have been an old rug thrown away as someone cleaned out the house. Autos were not yet a popular mode of transportation. From Unwin Place, to get to the city involved a 1/2 to 3/4 mile walk to the tram, as there was no service up Smith Lane in those days. I can remember the horse-drawn carriages in the funerals coming up Smith Lane Hill, past Unwin Place. The glass-panelled horse-drawn hearse leading the procession, the driver and undertaker up on the front seat wearing black silk top hats, and the horses with purple plumes, all en route to the church burial ground at the top of the hill. Since I was the youngest boy on the place, I was constantly subjected to the pranks of the Fernside brothers and Willie Froggatt. I still bear today a scar on my forehead from being hit by a stone thrown by Willie. I was up on Farmer Robinson's haystack under a roof supported by a stone column at each corner. I was dodging the stones he was throwing by using one column for protection. Unfortunately, while peeking around to see if he had gone, a missile he had already launched caught me flush on the head, releasing a flow of blood like ketchup from a broken bottle. That incident terminated what had hitherto been for me a fearful relationship with Willie, sir. The Fernside boys would constantly threaten to put worms down my neck and chase me at any opportunity. For the first 8 years, I seemed to have no choice but to play with the girls on the place who were about my age, Irene Grundy and the McCann sisters. At least I seemed able to hold my own with them. T once hit Renee McCann with a spade and cut her head open because she teased me beyond endurance. I had no friends then for a while, unless Irene Grundy came to play, as I was afraid to leave the end of the passage after that incident. I very often wonder if being compelled to associate more with the girls in those earlier years influenced my later years. I have always felt more at ease in the company of females. In general, I find them more capable of intelligent conversation than their male counterparts. On the other hand, it may be I am prone to feel inferior with my own kind. It is perhaps fitting that I should have been blessed with a wife and 3 daughters to share my joys and heartaches with for the greater part of my life. I suppose it is only natural that I would have been closer to my mother those first 8 years. After all, Dad had to be out at work, and since in those days children went to bed early, I should think about 6:02 p.m., I didn't see much of Dad except on weekends. He was by profession a painter and paperhanger, decorator, and a master of his craft, having served his apprenticeship at Messrs. Christopher Pratt's of Bradford, a firm of high-class tapestry. He was a methodical man, took great pride in his workmanship, cleaned up after each day's work and gave value for money, being in business for himself, albeit not too profitably. I remember he would shine his shoes every night without fail, ready for the next day. On weekends, you rarely saw him without a rose in his suit lapel. Roses were his passion, and off-season he would sometimes take me with him to Bradford Market, where we would go to the flower stall and buy a rose for the weekend. I shall never forget the beautiful smell of flowers in the market stall. He had a special stainless steel holder to fit the lapel that would be filled with water to keep the rose continually fresh. Back-to-back houses had at most about 8 square feet of garden, and the most important part of ours was Dad's roses. Making comparison now against then, times were much harder. As I have said, he was a decorator, and when he went from one job location to start at another, he had, as most of his contemporaries, a 2-wheeled push cart upon which he would load his heavy wooden extension ladders and step ladders, no aluminum in those days, and paints. This he would push uphill and down to or from his jobs. He earned his money indeed. On top of his regular job, he and Mother were caretakers, janitors at Little Lane Congregational Church. Sometimes I would have to go with one or both of them while they cleaned the church or in winter to stoke the boiler. I have happy memories of going to church there, particularly on Harvest Festival Sunday, the Sunday school treat, outing, the prize giving of a book for good attendance at Sunday school, etc. One outstanding memory of church was the stench of stale tobacco in the billiard room. It was overpowering. Church, of course, was inseparable from Sunday's day. If one thing has changed radically in my lifetime, it has been man's attitude toward the keeping of the Sabbath day. In my first 8 years, it was strict and unchanging. Most people went to church and children to both church service and Sunday school on Sunday morning. Again then to the evening service. There was no playing out. If a youngster went out between services, it was for a walk with parents, most often to Manningham Park on a fine sunny Sunday. If, as usual, there was a band in the park, the green collection box would be set up at each entrance to the park, an attendant with each. 1 penny or 2pence was the usual contribution per family as you passed through the gate, though the more affluent would toss in a silver 3-penny bit or a tanner, 6pence. The band would most often be a brass band, though occasionally a regimental military band of the British Army would perform. For about 3pence you could go in the enclosure facing the bandstand and sit on a comfortable seat. Otherwise one could just lounge on the grass and hear just as well. Little did I know that in some future time I myself would be a performer on the very same bandstand. There were other pleasures to be enjoyed in the park, of course. The famous Cartwright Hall with its museum, the rose gardens and greenhouses. Then there was also the lake where the kiddies could go for a 10-minute ride on a motorboat or fish for tiddlers with a fishing net and jam jar. Sometimes we would catch the tram car to Saltaire and walk up onto Shipley Glen and Baildon Moor, but never were we allowed to play out on Sunday. These were indeed genteel times. If you went out on Sunday, you went out dressed in your Sunday best. When a married couple out for a walk would chance upon another couple of their acquaintance, the men would always raise their hats to the ladies. These were times of honour, respect and consideration for others. Manners were strictly adhered to. If one went into someone's house with my father and didn't remove my cap, he would have knocked it off. On the bus or tram it was rare to see a youngster who would not offer his seat to an adult who had to stand. This was the era of walking sticks and bowler hats. No shops open on Sunday except one chemist for dispensing medicine in an emergency. Public transport did not start until noon. If society has lost or voluntarily given up anything that was priceless, it is the Sabbath day of that period. That one day in 7 when everything was quiet and restful. A time to reflect and recharge one's body and spirit in readiness for the demands of the week ahead. It will never again be reinstituted by man until the Lord makes known his pleasure in a future very close at hand. To me, those days in Daisy Hill seem to go on and on without any concern for the measurement of time. Weekdays seem to be much the same from week to week, only Saturday and Sunday bringing change. The one thing that was the high point of every day was the arrival of the milkman. At that time, the milk bottle had not been thought of as a medium for delivery of milk. The milkman would arrive with his daily supply in a horse-drawn cart, a smart, 2 large-wheeled cart with mud splashes over the wheels, a seat down each side inside. It was in a light brown, grained wood, highly varnished and obviously the pride of its owner. The horse with well-polished bridle and still more highly polished brasses would stand on unwin place, breathing hard after the pull up Smith Lane. The cart would stand there with a weighted rein until all the deliveries were complete. The cart would carry the driver, his assistant, a couple of large milk churns to replenish his oval-shaped milk pail, lidded as he lowered the contents on his round. At the door he would knock, lift the latch and open the door slightly and shout, "A milkman!" Mother would then bring her basin and tell him how much she wanted. If it was baking day, more, other days less. Inside his milk can he had a couple of ladles, 1 gill, pronounced gill, 1 pint, etc. These were hung on a rail inside the can by means of a curve in the top of the ladle handle. He could accurately give proper measure required by any of several combinations. This was indeed fresh milk. There was no such thing as pasteurized milk then. The cream stood thick on top of it, and of course was from a local farm of which there were many. Many were the times I gazed upon that cart, just hoping the milkman would take me for a ride in it, a forlorn hope nevertheless. Life was hard for working-class parents to provide new clothes for the kiddies at Whitsuntide, a week holiday once a year, and 1 toy at Christmas. After this was done, they saved again to provide the same each following year. Whitsunday was the day we children were donned up in our new clothes, and when uncles, aunts, and sometimes others saw us, they would put us 1 or 2 new shiny pennies in our pocket for our new clothes. I don't know if that custom has survived. Only 2 places do I remember being taken for yearly holiday. Scarborough on the Yorkshire coast once, aborted after I developed a severe toothache in a tooth which no dentist in Scarborough would pull. Hence, an early and disappointing return home. The place most often selected was Blackpool in Lancashire on the west coast. This a magical place to me. The trip by train was always a thrill. Waiting in the compartment of the train for departure, the excitement would be building inside me by the minute. The guard would blow his whistle and up front the driver would answer with the locomotive whistle at the same time, giving it steam as the platform seemed to slide away from us. Before long, we would be speeding through the green countryside, the wheels click-click, click-clicking on the rail joints. Occasionally, the smoke from the engine would drift down and obscure the view for a moment, and then just as suddenly clear to reveal the telegraph wires that, as my sigh followed them, seemed to rise and fall between the poles in a mesmerizing sequence. There would be a stream, now a rabbit in a field, some cows in a pasture, and there are 2 wooden painters carrying a plank which bore the name of a paint they were advertising. I don't know where they walked from or were walking to, but they would reappear farther up the line on one side or the other, every few miles. The next point of excitement was our arrival at Preston Station, Lancashire, one of the largest rail junctions in the north, through which the Royal Scot would pass each day on its breathtaking run from London to Scotland. Within 20 or 30 minutes of Blackpool now, the main line terminating there after running parallel to the promenade from South Station. There were 3 stations, South, Central and North, the latter being used in the main for excursion traffic in summer. Such was the influx of people in summertime. From my experience as a railwayman in later years, I would venture to suppose that outside of the London termini, Blackpool was the single busiest station of any in Britain during the summer months. The lodging house would be a long walk for little feet from the station, And though I never remember having a taxi, horse-drawn hackney cab, I rather think our limited resources would not afford us such luxury. Boarding houses seem to be more prolific than stars in the universe. There were quite literally thousands of them in all three areas of the town, south, central and north, ranging along both sides of every street from the promenade as far landward as Stanley Park. We always stayed with Mrs. Howarth on Palatine Road. Most of these establishments were run by married couples with hired help, but were known by the emisses rather than the emister. It is not unusual that coming from my tiny and limited world of Unwin Place, I should regard Mrs. Howarth's a palace by comparison. Passing through the iron gate leading to the path to the front door, the path was edged with typical fired Lancashire brick of a twisting scroll design separating the path from the flower border of delightfully smelling English wallflowers. Further into the front garden were the beautifully scented roses. At ground level, there was a park bench under the front bay window, which faced the garden and Palatine Road. This was usually to be found occupied by guests immediately before mealtimes, whilst they awaited the sound of the dinner gong. To the left of the front steps was a latticed fence and gate beyond which guests did not pass through, that being the domain of the owners and staff. To pass through the front door was a revelation. Never had I realised a house could have a reception hall with carpeted stairway to the upper floor with highly polished banister. On the wall hung a very large barometer of rosewood and polished brass with an ornate dial, the purpose of which was to remain a mystery until I was much older. We were shown to our room by Mrs. Howarth, there to unpack the suitcase which had been sent to luggage in advance by rail. The bedroom was a delight. Carpeted floor, gaslight, towel rack with rails for several towels, and a marble-topped washstand upon which stood a large porcelain bowl and large jug full of water for getting washed before going down to breakfast. Anxious to get to the sands and see, I suppose I made a nuisance of myself, hopefully to expedite matters. Walking down Palatine Road toward the affront soon brought us to Central Drive, which cut across at right angles and brought into my greedy view the many and various shops. These were designed no more, no less, than to separate the holiday-makers from their hard-earned abrasser. Money. Sweet shops galore with their rows of sweets. Candy, in identically shaped glass jars, all stood in rank and file like soldiers on parade. Then there were the toy shops with buckets and spades for the children, the little paper flags which children stuck in their newly erected castles and forts in the sand, and for me, the most coveted item of all, a sailing boat made with real cotton sails. Oh, happy days. Days to be relived many years later with our own 3 children. It seemed that inside and outside every shop were hundreds of postcards, both views and comic, the latter type which Blackpool seemed to specialise in and was famous for. To get down to the sands one had to first get to the promenade. The promenade and the sea came into view at one and the same time. Oh, what a sight for my young eyes! The far side of the promenade seemed like the edge of the once thought of flat earth. Over the edge and down below were the sands with the sea beyond. Water of such an expanse that it took my breath away, and I was unable to comprehend its magnitude. The promenade was railed off at the edge near the beach, and at different intervals along its length were steps down onto the beach. Blackpool sands. Nowhere else I have travelled have I seen sand so fine or with such a characteristically pleasant smell. Writing this, 3,000 miles away, I can still smell it with a nostalgic proboscis. Once on the sands, it took an intense hunger or otherwise a team of horses to move a child away from them. Always something to do. Paddle in the sea, dig in the sands, go for a donkey ride, watch the Punch and Judy show, or as once alarmingly happened, get lost. Having successfully been dragged away, we would make our way back to our digs for dinner or tea, the latter being the evening meal, as the case may be. Hungry as hunters, we would wait for the dinner gong to announce time to go to the dining room. What a tantalising delight to point a nose toward the front door and sniff the aroma of roast beef and promise of rice pudding to finish off. I make myself hungry just writing about it. The dining room, where friendly guests would chatter whilst the food was being served by the hired girls in their smart black dresses and white pinafores and headdresses. What a treat it must have been for Mother and the other mothers there to be able for a week to relax and be served by someone else. No food to prepare, no dishes to wash. Bless them all, how they deserved it. What seeming elegance this dining room presented to me in comparison to our humble one-room home. Likewise, the front lounge with the plush velvet-covered furniture. The guests would gather for a cup of tea and light refreshment late at night after coming in, after being out on the town for the evening. Next to the kitchen, I suppose the one bathroom was the busiest place. This was the only one for all the guests. Unheard of luxury to my view. A bath of white enamel with clawed feet, ornate fittings for the plumbing, a toilet that flushed by pulling a chain, the smell of scented soap. No wonder this house seemed like a palace with its ornate fireplaces in the main rooms, faceted coloured glass doorknobs, and porcelain push panels on each door. Even the chamber pots in the bedrooms were decorated with flower patterns. There were other exciting attractions. The tower, a somewhat smaller version of the Eiffel Tower, yet no less an attraction. The big Blackpool wheel. I remember going on it on one occasion and even allowing for the over-enhancement of size attributed to objects of our youth. It certainly was a mammoth structure. Each car was half the length of a railway passenger coach and had barred windows, the doors being locked after passengers were loaded in. Blackpool boasted 3 large piers, each extended well into the sea, and each had a full-sized theatre at the end with the sea swirling beneath. Opposite Central Pier was for me the main attraction. This was known as a fairyland. After you paid your money for the ride, you waited for a car to appear from out of the tunnel as it came into the daylight at the front of the building. The front of each car was shaped in the form of a dragon. Settled down for the ride, the car would move into the darkened tunnel, and along its seemingly endless travels on either side would appear moving tableau of elves busily at work with all kinds of tools. Fairies watching from the trees and behind the rocks, etc. There must have been thousands of hearts gladdened by this. As to us children over the years, it was indeed a fairyland. It was operated thusly from before 1924 until about 1965 or thereabouts, when we entered into the space age. The nature of the ride then was changed to one of space exploration, a change which saddened me as I always found it easy to believe in fairies after all. Who doesn't? All good things come to an end, alas, as do the days of the holiday. The only thing left to savour on the last day was the thought of an exciting trip home on the train. Arriving home again and back to work for Mother and Dad, starting from scratch again to save up enough money for a trip again the following year. Such was the lot of the English working man. The annual holiday was usually taken bowling tide week. On that week, most firms were closed, as was also the practice in Lancashire, known there as Wakes Week. Wakes Week and the different tide weeks in Yorkshire were the dates the tides or carnivals came to any particular town, being made up of steam swings, dodgems, roundabouts, and all of the usual paraphernalia of the sideshow. The most interesting items of the tide were the monolithic steam engines which provided the energy for lighting, steam swings and transportation when on the road. Traction engines were their proper name, and they were immaculately maintained. Polished brasswork, brightly painted wheels and boiler. The flywheel was usually painted a different colour, but the plain metal rim of it was very highly burnished with fine sandpaper. These were objects of great pride indeed. The long days of my freedom came to an end, I suppose, when I was 5 years of age. At no time of my life did school hold any appeal to me from starting at age 5 until leaving at 14. I would indeed be the last to say education was not a necessary part of life, but I would be the first in line to state that it was a very much overrated sacred cow, designed in these times, 1980s, to keep the coffers full first and the sacred and cloistered halls full secondly. In short, a business designed to reproduce its own kind, which by nature comprises the one half that never knows how the other half lives. Too much stress is placed on the where rather than the how of education. My own definition of education would be the process of gaining and learning knowledge, no matter how, when or where. Further, that this education is the application of knowledge with wisdom for the benefit of oneself, fellow man, and community wherein one lives and beyond. Daisy Hill School had a foreboding aspect. Almost at the very top of Daisy Hill, it was a stone structure, dark and dismal in appearance. From it one had a marvellous view on a clear day of Thornton and Ingro viaducts with the steam from an occasional train passing over in the distance. The well-worn stone slopes up from street to playground may as well have led to Hades, so much did I dislike it. Only one class did I like, and that was the outside garden project. I suppose the times we played with plasticine and beanbags were all right, but my stronger memories were of constantly getting my knuckles rapped with a pencil for getting my arithmetic wrong. Never did improve on that subject. I think the sum total of the time spent in Daisy Hill, my first school, accounted for King Alfred and the burned cakes, King Canute, who unsuccessfully bid the tiddy to recede, and one or two other well-known jockeys of English royal heritage lost in the limbo of centuries past. All was not lost, however. May Day in England was celebrated in several ways, i.e., selection of the May Queen, the dancing around the maypole, etc. The most important to me was the trimming up by our parents of our scooters, ferrocycles, in the hope that we might win a prize for the best turned-out item. Out of what schooling I had in England, I remember only 2 May Days. We all hoped and prayed, of course, for a fine day. During the previous week, the shopkeepers would do a good trade in crepe paper, which along with balloons and other items were used to decorate the children's entries. The first year I remember, I turned out with a scooter, operated by wearing out shoe leather on one foot whilst riding on the footboard with the other. Such a velocipede was representative of the poorest scholars at the school. Only one item came lower on the scale, and that was a plain iron hoop, wound around with crepe paper and propelled by a wooden peg. There were more of these poor kids than any other kind at our school. A goodly number had scooters and the minority had ferrocycles, children of well-to-do parents from Heaton area. I remember well the second May Day. One night, quite a surprise, Dad had brought me a small pedal-type motor car. I believe it was given by a customer, and I was indeed thrilled with this new toy which I could steer and operate from a sitting position. The novelty did in time wear off, precisely on the next May Day. I proudly took it to school all trimmed with coloured crepe paper, but alas, no prize. At that early age, not having too practical an understanding of right and wrong, and a strong belief that exchange was no robbery, I left the car at school and took home a beautiful 10 ferrocycle, something I had always longed for. I saw absolutely nothing wrong in this, nor the necessity of conferring previously with a now unhappy owner of a ferrocycle, who was still more unhappily a temporary owner of a slightly used, now third-hand motor car. It just seemed a normal thing to do, since bartering was not a new concept, if a little one-sided in this instance. Enough to say that mother, son and ferrocycle immediately went back to school, and the matter was amicably straightened out. Just one final reference regarding school. School students wore uniforms. For girls, it was a gym slip and blouse, blazer and beret. For boys, a blazer and a school cap with school insignia on both. Oh, how I longed for a blazer like the other kids, but all we could afford was a cap. Many times in my youth, my mother would say, "It isn't good for you to have all you want." It was a case of just not being able to afford things like that. Looking back from later years, I have appreciated the wisdom in that saying and considered it a privilege to have been poor, as our experiences have pulled us through extremely difficult times since, especially in raising our own family. Ill aunts and uncles, it would be easier to deal with my dad's side of the family first, as I knew very few of them. My granddad Horton Robertshaw was the only one I knew of my Robertshaw grandparents, Grandma Mary Ann Finney being dead longer than my memory can confirm. Any contact with Grandad Robertshaw being extremely limited. Indeed, I can say very little about him. I can only remember actually seeing him twice with any purpose, and that was because either Dad or Mum took me on both occasions. At the time, Grandad worked at a reservoir at the top of Haworth Road, Bradford. It was a very open area, undeveloped by housing, where the curlews cried and the beautiful song of the skylark could be heard unbroken from the moment it left the ground to rise in a vertical climb to a point beyond human sight. It would continue its song without pause until touching the ground again. From our vantage point at the reservoir, the view was magnificent, looking across to the bald moors sweeping down to the Aire Valley at Bingley, Keighley, pronounced Keithley, and in the extreme distance the hills around Skipton. Closer to hand were the villages of Allerton, Sandy Lane, where the Robertshaws seemed to stem from in those days, Willesden and Thornton, all in amongst a pattern of patchwork fields of different greens with stone wall borders, only here and there being a copse of trees. The city of Bradford was to our rear in the valley, with the hazy smoke of industry floating above, and the great chimney of Lister's Mill seeming to dominate all below it. Little did I think then that in later years I would be in charge of the 10 Lancashire port boilers beneath it that produced the power for perhaps the largest mill in the north of England. I remember approaching my granddad Norton Robertshaw that day. For some reason I was apprehensive, possibly due to never having seen much of him before, my apprehension now justified in witnessing his austere and monosyllabic manner. If remember rightly, he was whiskered, though no beard. Our meeting was brief, and I feel that altogether I have missed a great deal by only having a limited association with my father's side of the family. Perhaps in a later chapter I can deal with this more fully. The best remembered of Dad's family was his sister, Auntie Sissy. For most of the time I knew her, she lived in Allerton on the outskirts of Bradford. Our visits, while not too frequent, were often enough for me to know her well enough, and like her very much. She always made a fuss of me, and I would look forward to going to see her. On one occasion I disgraced myself. She had a black porcelain cat, whose creator decreed should live its life in a sitting-up position until one day I inadvertently broke it, as children will. It was always a thing of beauty to me, and I shall never know if I was forgiven. I feel sure I would be. Catastrophes are more imagined than real to children. Auntie Sissy had strong Robertshaw features and was a good-looking woman. I remember she spoke with a broad Yorkshire dialect and was married to Uncle Hiram. He was a gentleman I also liked but barely remember, as they separated for some reason, and he went to live in Derby, where he went to work in Derby carriage works of the Midland Railway. The times in my life I saw him I could easily count on one hand. Dad had a brother Jack, also variably known to me as Uncle John. According to my records yet to be confirmed, he was the second son, his wife being Alice, maiden name not yet known. They had 2 children, Kathleen the elder and Addie the younger. They have always 12 been strangers to me through no fault of my own. For whatever reasons, it was in spite of living only about 1.5 miles apart. Uncle John was, as far as I know, a chauffeur, and they lived under the shadow of Lister's Mill chimney in Bradford. The last was Auntie Emily Robinson. I know nothing much of a factual nature about her, but believe she was born out of wedlock. This I have yet to research. She lived at Glassharton, near Castleford, Yorkshire, with Uncle Harry and Cousin William. If I didn't see much of this nice family, it was not because I didn't want to. We all got along well, and it always was an event when we got together. They lived high on top of a sizable hill in the mining district near the South Yorkshire coalfields. It was a country area at the time, only 3 or 4 houses nearby, and they had a lot of land upon which they had, I suppose, a small holding, supplying vegetables to the local market. The most fascinating thing about these visits for me was the novelty of seeing the little caravan in which they lived. It was a proper gypsy caravan, horse-drawn home on wheels, although used in more of a semi-permanent state. Permanent steps had been constructed to the door, but the vehicle itself had a clerestory roof. There were 2 tiny bedrooms and some long, etched glass mirrors. There was also a cast-iron cooking range of the type I was to see in the USA later, but a very rare item to find in England. Each side of the clerestory had long, narrow glass lights of different coloured glass through which daylight filtered, giving off diffused coloured reflections on the opposite walls. They bred Yorkshire roller canaries, and all during the day the caravan would resound with chirps and long trills for which Yorkshire rollers were famous. It may be worthy of note that in the coal mining areas canary breeding was a prolific hobby, especially among miners. The birds would be taken down the mines to test for the presence of gas. If gas was present, of course, the canary immediately died and the pit would be cleared at once. The canary would die of the effects before a human would be aware of the presence of gas. Uncle Harry had a most beautiful flower garden, and we never said goodbye without an armful of flowers to take home to remember our trip. Always a major event for me. sometimes by train, sometimes by bus via Leeds and Castleford. At the time of this writing, 1985, my sister Ivy seems to think Emily was the oldest of the children, though as before mentioned, born out of wedlock. Uncle Harry, Auntie Emily, and Cousin William, who lived with them, always remain a pleasant memory for me. It has occurred to me that thus far have made little mention of my sister Ivy. In considering this fact, the reason would seem to be that there was a difference in our ages of 7 years. If, then, my memory did not start to fulfill its purpose until I was about 4, it only left me 4 years to get to know much about her before leaving for the USA during that period. One thing stands out forcefully: her music lessons at home. Learning to play a violin must be a very difficult endeavour, but a far harder one is to be in the same room day after day and be compelled to listen to the scratchings and squawkings of someone trying to overcome that difficult learning endeavour. I think I must have been the youngest person ever to know by heart the minuet in G. She once told Mother not to feel she wasted money on her music lessons, for though she never played in an orchestra or became a soloist, it did help her acquire a taste for the classics. A worthy sentiment indeed. I too learned to love the classics, but it was through other channels, and, I might add, in spite of the violin. 13 other things I remember about my sister. In order of memory, we would chalk a wicket on the midden wall, in Yorkshire, a walled space between 2 toilets which neighbours shared to throw refuse. This was emptied once a week by the midden men who came with horse and cart. From the end of the passage at 31 Unwin Place, one of us would bow the ball and try to hit the wicket before the batter could hit the ball with the cricket bat. We did this often, weather permitting. On Pancake Tuesday, whips and tops were the rage for a few weeks each year. The whip was just a wooden handle with a leather lace through the end. By lashing the top, it could be kept spinning like mad for long periods of time. One deviation was to chalk the round top end of the top itself in different colours. This made each top have its own pattern as it was spinning. I guess I was too young to even get it to spin, unlike Ivy, who could do so and keep it going. One other event I remember concerning her was a bad burn she got around Plot Night, November 5, each year, to remember the Gunpowder Plot, when Sir Guy Fawkes attempted to blow up Parliament. I often felt in later years that if Parliament was constituted then, as it sometimes is now, his idea was perhaps not without merit. Fireworks and bonfires were a feature of this date cashier. The children would go a-chumping cade of wood they could find. There would be a bonfire on virtually every street that night. It seems that on this particular occasion, Ivy was holding a sparkler when some of the extremely hot molten combustible substance fell from the wire onto her leg, giving her a severe and dangerous burn. The last incident happened when we had to go to Liverpool one day in order that the whole family could be physically examined before being granted visas to travel to America. This took place in a building on one of the large floating docks where the ocean-going liners used to berth. Whether it was imagined movement of the dock or not that caused it, she was apparently seasick, evoking a question from a nearby seaman as to whether she had been eating tomato skins. A scornful look in return was the best she could muster. The other side of the family was that of Grandad Harry Walker and Grandma Webb. Grandad, as I remember him, was a pleasant man, always stout with a predilection for playing cards and particularly dominoes, smoked a pipe, and had eyes which kept you always in doubt as to whom he was looking at, they being set at an obtuse angle. Thus they were for as long as I knew him, though Mom always said he could have had them corrected but wouldn't. A clean-shaven man, a plumber by trade, he had been a firefighter at one time. Although I didn't know until Jay left England's shores some years later, he had been an amateur musician, having played the cornet. Trumpet. He liked to visit the public house more than the family could afford for more beer than I suppose he needed. He was a Victorian in the matter of the discipline of his children, a normal circumstance in those days. He always seemed a very kindly man to me, and young and old were on common ground and equals on the frequent occasions he took me up to his hen, run and greenhouse, about a quarter-mile away from Grandma's at Park Street, Shipley. There he would feed the hens with mash, Indian corn and a throwaway cauliflowers tied up on strings for the hens to peck at. These were supplied by the local greengrocer, no doubt. After he had taken care of the hens, we would go into the greenhouse where he would pick off 2 or 3 small tomatoes and give them to me. Never before or since have I had such succulent tomatoes as he could grow. There was always a penalty to pay for what for me was always a treat. Once inside the hen run, it was 14 dirty underfoot, and I inevitably picked up some hen droppings on my shoes or socks. Getting back to 8 Park Street would be teased to tears by my aunts and uncles as they came home from the mill as they finished work. They never failed to ask me if other hens had kicked me when they saw the hen dirt on me. Grandma Walker had to be close to everyone's idea of the ideal grandma. Grey, tired, kindly eyes misting with age. A woman who had raised a large family and showed the effects in her face of hard work and wear and tear. It was always a pleasure for me to visit her with Mom when I was little. We would spend most of the day with her, and I don't seem to remember going when there was not an earthenware crock-pot of stew on top of the oven at the side of the fire. I wish I could say more about her, but the opportunity of seeing much of her was limited. It was 2 tram rides away, and there was not private means of transportation in those days. I believe Auntie Annie, Edith Annie, and Uncle Alfred Slingsby left England in 1923 to live in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, in the United States of America. Subsequent to that, Grandma made a visit to them prior to our leaving England's shores. We went to see her off on the Cunard liner Isa Maria. I remember as the big ship pulled away from the dock at Liverpool, seeing her little one figure at the rail of the ship, unable to see us waving as her sight was dimming with age. She was held up on Ellis Island for an extended period because of her sight, but eventually passed through. She loved America and wanted to make a second visit, but I don't believe she ever made it. I don't remember much of Auntie Annie, apart from what she looked like. Also Uncle Alf, a really wonderful man. A gentleman by name and nature, a good musician, violinist, who had his own small ensemble. When dressed for an engagement, he looked really smart. White shirt, dicky bow, dark suit and a spats. Well-dressed men wore spats in those days. Being made of grey felt, they fit around the ankles, buttoned up the side and had a strap passing under the shoe also buckling on the side. It really made a finished appearance to a man who knew how to dress as they did in those days. Auntie Mary was not too well known to me in those first 8 years. She was married to Uncle Charlie Smith, who was a native of Norfolk, a county in East Anglia. He was a man I liked, but was to get to know and love a lot more in later years. Apart from a short time when they lived overlooking the railway station at Saltaire, near Shipley, they lived in the village of Congham in Norfolk. I think that it was while they lived in Saltaire that my cousin Betty was born, their only child. Uncle Charlie had an allotment garden, piece of a large parcel of land rented at a nominal fee to village residents for the purpose of growing their own vegetables, etc. House gardens were usually very small in working-class areas, only good for growing a few flowers. This was on the opposite side of Victoria Road overlooking the Midland Railway main line and salts mill. It was not surprising that he kept a sizable garden after seeing his garden in Norfolk some years later. In my description of uncles and aunts, I will not necessarily take them in chronological order, as this will be done correctly on the family group sheet of my genealogical records. My uncle Stanley, Herbert Stanley Walker. I never knew. He was killed in the First World War. He was in the British Navy as a stoker, but there is conflict in what I have heard regarding the circumstances of his death. One was that he was blown to pieces on land as reported by an eyewitness. How this might be when he was a naval rating, I can't say. As Mother 15 is now 94 years old, and having recently suffered a stroke, she is unable to convey whatever may be in her mind that would help. Auntie Alice, also still alive, may help resolve some of these doubts which I will record later on. Uncle Leonard was one I remember only slightly as he left for America to join Auntie Annie and Uncle Alf, therefore shortening the amount of time I may have had to know him better. He married Auntie Ethel. I am not sure just now, but I think this took place after he got to America. He had the facial characteristics of most of the Walker family, but was distinctly darker skinned with tight curly hair. One night we were at home in Unwin Place when a knock came to the door. It may have been about 1926, 60 years ago, yet ill is as clear in my mind as if it were yesterday. The phonograph was playing a Blue Danube when Dad opened and read the cablegram. It was the only time in my life I ever saw Father cry. Uncle Leonard had been killed in a car crash riding home in a carpool to Pawtucket, Rhode Island. A truck was stopped at the bottom of dip in the road with no lights on. The car slammed into it, and Uncle Leonard died. Uncle Robert, Bob, was unmarried when he also left to follow Leonard to America. I remember more of him, I think, because when he came home from work, he would exchange banter with Alice and Lillian, the latter always affectionately known in the family as Bill. He would sometimes take his newspaper and swat them with it to the amusement of all present. Uncle Clarence may have been married and left Park Street, as I don't remember much of him. One thing I know, if he had obtuse eyes, he would have been a slimmer version of Grandad Walker. Facially, he was the double of him. She also worked in the mill. She married Uncle Jim Verity before our family left England. She was a favourite with me, as was Uncle Jim. He was a smallish man, but a lively person who liked to joke and plenty of fun. Like his namesake, Headley Verity, who played for England, Jim was a good cricket player. Playing in the Bradford League, he used to amuse me the way he could take a jam tart and put it in his mouth in one bite, at the same time risking a wrathful scolding for doing so from Auntie Alice. Lillian Bill. The youngest of my aunts of the Walker clan was to be a lifetime favourite. She was the only woman I ever saw smoke. It was taboo for women in those days. Grandma used to complain about someone who kept throwing cigarette butts outside the front of the house. I don't believe she ever knew it was Lillian who, when sneaking a few drags up in her bedroom in the attic, would hurriedly flick it out of the window when she heard anyone on the stairs. I remember also her going with us on holiday to Blackpool for a week. I think Uncle Jack would be the last on my list. The youngest of the Walker boys. Like Dad, he was apprenticed to the painting trade for a Shipley firm. A good man, an intelligent man, and excellent at his job. Grandma used to keep a supply of malt and cod liver oil for him. I don't think I ever visited Park Street without having a couple of spoonfuls out of the jar. Left alone, I could empty the jar on my own. I loved it. Usually it was given to children to protect them against the winter colds. The malt was to make it more palatable. It was not uncommon to find 10 or 12 children in a family of Grandma's times, so doctors were generally unaffordable and home remedies were relied upon 90% of the time, except, of course, in cases of extreme emergency. I am now 65 years of age as I write this journal, and it is a time of my life at which I must concede that my appearance belies my physical condition. If my mind had not already accepted this fact, my legs are ever ready to remind me. If I had $1 for every mile they had carried me, I feel I would be a millionaire by now. I must not complain, though. There are many cripples who would be just glad enough to have one of them. My walking began in earnest as a toddler. From the time I was able, Mom, and I would walk from Unwin Place all the way to Manningham Lane where we could catch a tram to Shipley. That walk was almost 2 miles, mostly downhill but which had to be made uphill on the return home. You can be sure I made my displeasure known on the uphill leg of the trip in the most effective way possible, but all it ever profited me was a wallop behind the ears to quiet me. Thus it was each week on the day we visited Grandma at 8 Park Street, Shipley. It would be interesting to know at what early age we begin to remember. I was 3 years old when we went with a church trip to Milan. It was the practice to catch a train from Bradford to Belbusk, north of Skipton, Yorkshire. From there, it was all on foot along paths over farmland alongside the River Aire until arriving at Milan Cove, 7 miles distant. The cove itself was a massive ravine ending in a vertical cliff about 350 feet high. Issuing from underneath the vertical stone fault, bubbled the River Aire as it saw the light of day for the first time. Although only 3 years old, I can remember the walking part of that trip. At one point along the river path, one of the men in the group poked with his walking stick into a puddle of water lodged in some tree roots out of which jumped the first frogs I ever saw. Mom has often testified that I was the talk of the group at my ability and evident willingness to walk there and back at 3 years of age. I know I could not do it now without many and frequent rests. To round off my remarks on aunts and uncles, I have to take into account an honorary aunt and uncle, Auntie Mabel and Uncle Fred Bolt. They were as close or closer to me than some of my proper ones. Uncle Fred and Dad first met when they were both indentured apprentices to Christopher Pratt's Limited, the highest class store in the city of Bradford. It was to be a very close relationship between both families for many years. The Bolts had two sons, Fred and Roland. Fred, the older of the two, joined Father Fred as Fred Bolt and Son Painters and Decorators. After World War II, it was Bolt and Sons when Roland returned after being a prisoner of war. Fred had been a conscientious objector and was compelled to leave the business for the duration and do war-related work. The Bolts lived on the other side of Bradford in West Bowling. Mom would go up to see Auntie Mabel often with me, and I loved it. The house itself, though a terrace house, was the first in the row and somewhat larger than the others. It was a fascination in itself. It had a bathroom of sorts, a front staircase which you could ascend and a rear one to descend if you so wished, which I frequently did for a novelty. It was like walking a vertical circle. There was one room upstairs where young Fred bred canaries and one room where Uncle Fred stored his wallpaper stock and equipment. He had a shed outside where he kept his paints, etc. I don't know why, but it always seemed to be a wet day on our visits to West Bowling. If it was wet and dismal and I was unable to play out, I would sit and look out of the kitchen window at the soapworks next door. There was a steam exhaust pipe of perhaps 5 inches in diameter running up to the roof and ended with a 45-degree angle, from which would issue a large puff of steam about every second, with an initial crack and a whoosh. Obviously produced by some sort of a reciprocating engine I would often wonder about. 17 Roland and I were about the same age and were great friends. It seems most Saturdays in the year we would go to Auntie Mabel's for tea, and then the adults would play cards and Roland, and I would always find something to amuse us. On fine days I would play out in the walled-in yard, amusing myself by walking along the rungs of the painters' ladders laid on the ground. One day Roland and I were playing with some of the boys of the neighbourhood. We were in a builder's yard, and amongst the paraphernalia was an old tub with dirty, rusty water in it, also a hollow metal pipe. We were taking turns seeing who had the most suction to draw the water into the pipe. I must have been the most successful as I got a mouthful and inadvertently swallowed some. The rest of the kids noticed my distress and added to it by telling me that I would now catch a fever. I was terrified and ran into Auntie Mabel's house on Little Cross Street. I sat in silence and ignorant fear. I didn't tell anyone and suffered with worry for days waiting to get sick, which of course I didn't. Many times have I thought since how much worry and fear I could have saved myself had I only gone to my parents with my problems. How little as children do we realise that our greatest fears can be dismissed many times by their wisdom and understanding. 18 old-time Christmases in those earliest years of my memories. Christmas, of course, was a magical time. The tree was small and artificial and had the same decorations each year. It had special clips to hold regular wax candles, and I remember the little tin baskets with sprung lids that held sweets when on the tree. Usually once a year before Christmas, my folks would take me down to Saina's shop in downtown Shipley to see the toys. Could never wait to get there. It was tame to what I would see in America a few years hence, yet no less exciting. Would gaze wide-eyed with doubtful hope that Santa would bring me one of those Homby clockwork trains. One year he did, complete with station. Children then did not expect nor get a lot, usually one major toy. The only other thing we usually got was in the stocking we hung up Christmas Eve. In the morning we would usually find 4 or 5 shiny new pennies, a lot of money since I only received 1 penny a week to spend, a large Jaffa orange, a shiny red apple, and a few nuts. Christmas morning we would be able to hear nearby one of the many brass bands of Bradford playing Christmas carols. They would move along to different locations each time after they had played a set of carols. This was a tradition in Yorkshire, at any rate, and was still done up to 1963 when we emigrated to the United States. The thought of a chicken or turkey for Christmas dinner never entered one's head. A roast of pork was the best that could be afforded, a tasty meal nevertheless, and always finished off with plum pudding and custard. Christmas in England, as long as I can remember, consisted of a 2-day holiday, Christmas Day and Boxing Day. Each town or city having a professional soccer team would have a game at home on one of the 2 days, playing the same team at their ground on the other day. Bradford had 2 teams, Bradford City and Bradford Park Avenue. It was thus a feast for football fans as each of the Bradford teams had a game at home at Christmas. Parties were of the Yuletide tradition, mainly consisting of family members in one big party. These were not drinking bouts, but very pleasant and fun-producing occasions. Games were played where all could join in and were a riot of fun. If any drink was served, it would be no more than a glass of wine accompanied by fresh mince tarts, and Christmas cake was usually served with a piece of cheese. Oh, that Christmas could be like that again, instead of the commercialised sham it has become. Just before winding up the first 8 years, let me make some brief observations of the times. Automobiles were seldom seen, and were objects of great interest when they were. Furniture moving, cabs, industrial transportation, heavy bales of wool, etc., were almost all horse-drawn, though there were some steam traction engines. Public transportation was by tram car and some trolleybuses, trackless, with solid rubber tyres. A rough riding vehicle indeed, as streets were cobbled for horse traction. There was an abundance of men with one arm, male men, legless men, men with eye patches and some with pitiful face disfigurement. One man, I remember, had no legs on a sled, like conveyance which he propelled by pushing alongside with sticks held in either hand, while riding about 6 inches above the ground. Another such legless man was better off. He at least 19 had a type of wheelchair which he steered with his back and propelled with left and right and hand-operated cranks with a chain mechanism. How many men I saw who suffered silently from effects of being caught in a gas attack, I shall never know. No, these were some of the survivors of the First World War. Perhaps remnants would better describe them. My father was a stretcher-bearer, medic, about which I shall say more later. I never saw an airplane in those Carly years. The only airborne contraption I did see was a hot air balloon. Manners were in evidence. A gentleman meeting a lady or passing one he knew in public would doff his cap. Children did not have to be told to get up to give an older person a seat in public conveyances. People waited for buses, etc., in orderly lines, strictly keeping to their proper place in line. When visiting with parents, you removed your cap as you went into the house and remained where you were put until permitted to leave. You did not speak unless spoken to, and said a thank you for any kindness shown. The postal service of the time was unrivalled anywhere. There were 4 deliveries a day in the cities, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. At about 10:00 p.m, tramcars leaving outlying points carried a mailbox on the rear. From the outlying point and at any of the regular stops en route to the city, one could mail letters which would be collected as each tram reached town and sorted for delivery the next day. This service ended at the outbreak of World War II. It was never reinstated. Home entertainment consisted of playing cards, snakes and ladders, dominoes, etc., or listening to the gramophone, phonograph. For this we had just a few records for our table model. One was selections from a Messiah, a Blue Danube, and for myself and Ivy, Whistler and his dog. A little later we managed to buy a wireless radio. There were no speakers to this, just earphones, 2 pairs, and a crystal and cat's whisker. The latter were mounted in a glass cylinder. The whisker was mounted on the end of a metal rod about 3 inches by 1, 1/8 inch free to rotate in a ball and socket mount. The whisker was a very thin piece of springy conductor wire aptly named for its thinness. It rested on the surface of the crystal, which was circular and raised up, rough and uneven in places. The trick was to find the station by donning the earphones and listening to the scratching of the whisker, until after a lot of patience you hit the right spot on the crystal and picked up the BBC station. Then you remained as still as possible, as any small vibrations would throw the whisker off and you would have to start all over again. If you had plenty of money, you could get a loudspeaker set, which wasn't very loud, but we were never to have one of those. A special treat would be to get an invitation, rare, to a home where they had a magic lantern. A bedsheet would be hung on a wall and hand-painted pictures on glass would be projected. If you went to one of these, it was something to swank about. No electricity, of course, so the projector or lantern would possibly have had carbide as a source of illumination. The lantern had a chimney to dissipate the heat. In the late 1920s, the silent movies had started, and my sister and I would sometimes go to the Colosseum to see a Felix the Cat cartoon or a E. Charlie Chaplin movie. For the most part, the theatres in the city provided live entertainment. In Bradford, the Princess Theatre catered to playgoers. The Alhambra was a better quality variety theatre with frequent musical shows, such as Gilbert and Sullivan productions, Rose Marie, Dad's Favourite, Chocolate Soldier, Student 20 Prince, Maid of the Mountains Desert Song, etc., with the traditional pantomime running from Boxing Day until March. The pantomime has been traditional Christmas fare for many, many years. It is basically a musical comedy play written around a well-known fairy tale. Sometimes Jack and the Beanstalk, Red Riding Hood, Humpty Dumpty, etc. The principal boy and principal girl parts are always played by girls. There would always be a top-name comedian in it as well as other individual acts, all woven into the story. The other variety theatre, the Bradford Empire, was the poor man's of Umbra, but had excellent variety shows. Burlesque, each week, and a pantomime at Christmas. The only pantomime I went to in those days was at the Empire up in the Agods, top balcony. Such was life. It was still a wonderful treat to go with Mom, Roland and Auntie Mabel. The Empire was pulled down in the early 1930 era. Unfortunately, this was a great loss to the working class of Bradford, as admission was considerably cheaper than the Alhambra. The policemen of the day, bobbies, were, I suppose, not of the educational level of today's men in blue, but sufficient unto the job thereof. Becky N.Y., full of common sense, courteous and efficient, they did not hesitate to cuff a youngster who got out of line. It was not overdone by all accounts and would achieve the desired results at no cost to society. There were two places in Bradford in those days where bobbies always went. In White Abbey, through which we passed en route to Bradford City on the tram, the other place was Wapping. They were both very tough slum neighbourhoods which didn't encourage strangers. Electric flashlights, torches, had only just been invented then, and sometimes the bobbies would come to our door in the dark of night and shine their paraffin lanterns up at the bedroom to get Dad out of bed to go down to Little Land Church to lock a door someone had left insecure after an event. This happened occasionally since being the caretaker, Dad had the key. These paraffin lamps did not throw much light, and the bobby on night beat would have it lit all the while, fastened to his wide black leather belt. They were always on foot, except for the sergeant, who had a bicycle on which he could cover the area, checking his men on the beat and signing their books as he met each one. Late in 1927, the talk in our home seemed to turn more and more frequently to the subject of going to America. It became more of a reality in 1928, when we had all to go to Liverpool for physical exams and vaccinations. The results of the vaccinations are vivid in my memory. We all sported scabby arms, and some of us were quite sick as a result. My sister Ivy was sick on the floating dock in Liverpool, as I believe I have before mentioned, but we seemed to be quite some time before we recovered from the effects of that particular trip to the port from which we would eventually sail. I was certain we were to leave England when one day a new large wooden packing case was delivered to Unwin Place. It was quite a large box, big enough to hold all the belongings we were to take, excepting furniture, of course. Made of new unpainted wood, it was labelled to our new address in America and was marked for hold, not wanted on voyage. All this and name and address painted in black with shipping date and port of lading. This would be the start of a great adventure, which would ultimately affect the lives of so many people. 21 The ocean voyage boarding a liner prior to sailing afforded both passenger and visitor an opportunity to see all sections of the ship from lower decks to first-class promenade and fore and aft decks. Our ship was the Cunard Line Laconia. She would have been of about 25,000 tons displacement and towered above the landing stage at Princess Dock on the Mersey at Liverpool. It was sometime in May of 1928, the day we sailed. One don't recall who, if anyone, came to see us off. The massive boarding stage was suspended by a crane, and like a bridge, crossed from the upper floor of the docks to the large double hatchway in the port side of the ship. Upon crossing the gangway, our passports and documents were examined and we were permitted to board. Once inside the entrance hall, I stood awestruck at the beauty of what I saw. The highly polished balustraded staircases leading up to the first-class decks, the marble pillars, the lifts, elevators, the shops, the ship's officers, immaculate in navy blue and gold braid, the stewards in dark trousers and white jackets directing you to your cabin, ending obvious confusion. Once installed in our tiny cabin, we were free to roam the ship in any of its public areas. It wasn't the swimming pool in first class that captured my imagination, but the first-class dining room. There was a large double-door entrance from the main deck. I had never seen a more beautiful room before, nor perhaps will I ever again. The decorations were of a soft green colour and the room 2 stories high. On a recess on an upper balcony, a salon orchestra was playing as it overlooked the many, many white cloth-covered tables below, each bedecked with small vase and flowers, and awaiting setting for the first meal at sea. Beneath the feet was lush, soft carpeting. Everywhere there were people in groups, some sad, some happy, and I suppose some a mixture of both. We saw the gymnasium, the library, walked up and down steps, around the decks, and marvelled at the size of the lifeboats which had looked so small from the shore. Eventually came that dreaded yet exciting moment when the stewards went around the ship from stem to stern, ringing those peculiar-sounding brass Chinese gongs and shouting, "All ashore, that's going ashore." About the same time the ship's siren, more like a very deep-throated foghorn, blasted and shook the ship for a few seconds. It was time to make sad farewells before lining the ship's rails to wave a last goodbye after the gangway had been swung away from the side. It was an experience I find hard to describe. In those days it was for most people a last goodbye and was with a feeling you might never see your loved ones and homeland again. Some of mine never did. Deckhands were standing by winches and capstans as men on the dock cast off the heavy mooring ropes as thick as a man's leg. The ship was now vibrating with the throb of the engines deep down in the engine room. They would not be called upon to produce a real effort until the ship was well out into the River Mersey, Liverpool on one side, Birkenhead on the other. As the great ship pulled away from the dock, passengers lining the rails and visitors now on shore were waving and shouting. Little by little, faces that you might know became just rough circles without features, until finally distance severed the link completely as the tug swung the Laconia around 180 degrees to face the estuary and open sea. I never knew what a tugboat was before, but now as I looked down upon them from the deck, they looked no larger than mere rowboats. They were like small terriers worrying at the heels of some monstrous animal. Even now, as I write, I am intrigued by their unpretentious power, mystery of their masthead indication 22 lights, and how several of them, apparently without effort, can maneuver a giant ship when separated and out of sight of each other, the ship itself screening them from each other. Once in the Mersey Channel, the tugs dropped behind as did the port of Liverpool, the well-known landmarks of the Royal Liver Building there fading to nothing as we headed out of the Mersey estuary, the graveyard of HM. Submarine Thetis, which sunk while on trials in the 30s, and into open sea, we were bound next for the west coast of Ireland, there to pick up the Irish immigrants. I don't remember if it was the same day or the next day that we stood off Galway and dropped anchor to await the small tender coming out to transfer passengers. I remember now, it was the next day as we had already eaten a couple of meals in the third-class dining room in quiet surroundings. For the rest of the trip, it was rather more noisy, as the Irish were as demonstrative as the English were reserved, until we got to know our table companions better. I have never set foot in Ireland, but the title Emerald Isle must be an apt description from what I saw of the green hills rolling down to the sea. Time at sea seems to evaporate. The ship's bell meant nothing if you weren't a sailor, and your appetite, if you still had one, was the best guide to the time of day. If you were seasick, you lost virtually everything including sense of time, direction or will to live. Our cabin was located about 2 decks above the engine room and mid-beam. Having no porthole, being close to the engine room, we were close enough to be affected by the smell of oil and grease emitting therefrom. This, in combination with the capricious motions of the ship, brought about the expected results. We were all seasick. The cabin was small. 2 bunks on each side, one above the other. I shall always be thankful I occupied a top bunk, Mom and Dad in the lower, Ivy on the other top. There was a mirror on the wall, and wash basin beneath opposite the door as you entered the cabin. Just in front of the wash basin on the floor was the vessel. It was a copper pan which fit between the 2 lower bunks and had a handle on each end. It was operated by 2 people in the lower bunks when someone in the top bunk was ill. One used to shout, "A quick, mother, quick," when I felt the need, whereupon Mom and Dad would reach out of their bunk, grab a handle, and each lift up the pan until I made my deposit. I would then collapse back onto my bunk, not caring if the ship went down or not. More often than not, it would touch off a chain reaction. Poor Dad. He was sick for most of the week. Once over the seasickness, life on a liner is the ultimate experience. For this 8-year-old boy, it was a new world waiting to be discovered. I wasted no time in this regard, and once having left our cabin in the morning, did not see it again until bedtime at night. If early enough on deck, the ordinary seaman could be seen swabbing the decks, wide-bottomed trousers rolled up, exposing bare feet. If on the foredeck, the sound of hissing salt water assailed the ears as the bow of the ship cut through a pliant road beneath. The bow waves thus created crested and slapped on smoother water further to the rear of the hull. To look down from the deck and watch this repetition of motion had a most hypnotic effect. I soon got acquainted with one of the sailors, Mr. Harrison of Liverpool, and he seemed to relish satisfying my youthful questions and curiosity. Before the week was out, he had shown me parts of the ship normally not seen by passengers. The first was the steering compartment at the stern. When helm was applied on the bridge, machinery in the steering compartment responded to move the massive rudder the desired amount. Notwithstanding helm applied at the 23 wheel, the machinery seemed to automatically apply a constant slight degree of port and starboard rudder, alternating like a pendulum. Although in theory, I suppose this should produce an irregular course, the ship's wake always seemed as straight as an arrow. I have never learned if this was a false impression or a fact, and that in reality the rudder was held motionless until a change of course was required. One day Mr. Harrison treated me to a visit to the engine room and the boiler room. Access was made by way of the steerage deck through a watertight compartment door. This led immediately onto a steel stepped gangway sloping to different levels of the tremendous engine room. The steps were of the open type, permitting one's gaze to travel through space until it rested on the engine room floor way below. It had a dizzying effect on me. All the brightwork of metal parts were highly polished steel, the brass gauges reflecting with the steel the electric lights, the only source of illumination since we were below water level and there were no portholes. Even the handrails glistened on the steel gangways. It was obvious that the engine room staff had great pride in their plant. From high above we entered. The heat and smell of hot lubrication met us. Far away on the other side we could see the stoke hold. There were several boilers in a row. How many I don't know, but with my present knowledge of boilers, they appeared to be single-port Cornish or twin-port Lancashire boilers, and not upright marine type as might be expected. I am going back many years, and my memory may be in error on this point. The stokers were stripped to the waist with only a neckerchief above. The great coal bunkers were behind them as they faced the boilers. One man had a slice bar in his fire, another was feeding his, while others rested on shovel handles. A very exciting and satisfying day for me. My last visit to Mr. Harrison was at the end of the week along with my sister. We were invited to his cabin in the forecastle for tea and confectionery. He may well be dead as I write, but I shall never forget his kindness. If I thought our cabin was small, his defied description. However, he did have a porthole. One day of the week it was foggy all day. Navigation then was done without radar, it not having been invented. It is a little more nerve-wracking over a long period. The bow watch and mast head watch were doubled for this situation, and the ship's whistle blasted out a monotonous plea to a pass clear every few seconds throughout the day. Days like this were better spent in the gym, library or writing room. Of the topics to write about, the food must have ranked amongst the most popular. Breakfasts were substantial, but lunch and dinner were superb. They offered a large and varied menu, and just as much as you wanted of it. Ice cream was on the dessert menu at all the main meals, along with other tempting sweets. The bread was baked fresh each day, and I remember most of all the dinner buns. Served fresh with hard, crusty outsides, cut and laced with butter, they challenged anyone's ability not to overindulge before the main course was served. We were never in such rough seas that it was necessary to grab at the condiments as they slid by you on the table. Snacks were served on deck between breakfast, lunch and dinner. The former consisted of Bovril beef stock and buttered bun. The afternoon snack, usually a cup of tea and cakes. It was your own fault if you suffered from hunger on board. Passengers had their own deck steward, cabin steward and stewardess, the latter attending you when seasick, usually serving dry crackers to eat. This at best being about all you 24 could force down. It was in the steward's best interest to look after you well, since a decent tip was expected at voyage end. Finally, we approached the American shores, and the night before was spent repacking clothing used en route, and the following morning after breakfast we said our farewells to new friends made on the voyage. Liners from England departed from Liverpool, calling in Ireland, and disembarking in Boston. An alternative was to leave on the ship from Southampton via Cherbourg, France, disembarking in New York. Since we lived closer to Liverpool and our ultimate destination was closer to Boston, we used the Boston service. It is strange that memory can be precise in some details and nebulous in others. My memories of the approach to the port of Boston are vague. They come into focus as the seamen were tossing the heaving lines ashore as we were docking at the pier. I remember different levels of the pier buildings, open to the weather and thronged with seeming thousands of people, so close as to be able to distinguish faces. How Auntie Annie and Uncle Alf Slingsby found us I shall never know, yet find us they did, ending just over the first 8 years of my life. 25, the next 6 years, Tons told the youth in the Sunday school class. I was teaching that any action they took, or any decision they made at any time may ultimately affect, or have an effect upon someone else. Sometime between 1920 and 1923, Bill Varley and his wife and daughter left Shipley to emigrate to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, USA. This was an original cause. Subsequently, some friends of theirs, Tom and Mary Rhodes, were persuaded to follow. Later my Auntie Annie, Edith Walker Slingsby, and Uncle Alf Slingsby, seeing their friends the Rhodes succeeding, also decided to emigrate to Pawtucket. That was in 1923. Uncle Leonard followed, and later Uncle Bob, Robert Walker. My mother, Dad, sister and myself came in 1928. Mom has told me that she wanted to come earlier, but Dad did not. When Dad did decide to come, we landed almost on the threshold of the Great Depression. Thus was the ultimate effect as we disembarked from the Laconia in Boston, Massachusetts, that day in May of 1928. I suppose there was too much conversation going on for me to notice much of Boston. I could hardly believe what I was experiencing. Here I was in a new, strange and exciting country, riding in a car, no less. This was beyond anything I had ever experienced in my wildest dreams. Up to now I had seen few enough of them, yet here I was in the wink of an eye, so it seemed, riding in one. It was a late spring day, hot by English standards, sunny and really beautiful to make an entrance into a new world after completing the customs and immigration formalities at the docks. Uncle's car was a Dart open touring car. Open was an apt description. The only glass in the car was the windshield, the sides of the car above the doors being open to the elements. Very fine on a day like this, but when it rained, the car had to be stopped and the flexible sides fastened to the car by snaps in the canvas. These side covers were made of waterproof canvas and had flexible celluloid windows, which allowed them to be removed and rolled up when not in use. The single windshield wiper was hand-operated from inside the car. To start the car, the driver had to get out and crank it up with a hand crank at the front below the radiator. If you didn't hold it correctly and the engine kicked back, the crank handle would whip back and break your thumb. The 40-plus miles from Boston to Pawtucket made little impression upon my mind, apart from a general sense of being surrounded by trees. There is not much else I remember, the towns through which we passed, or anything else, but one thing. We stopped en route on the side of the road in a shady spot to partake of some sandwiches and a drink of Auntie Annie's root beer. The sandwiches we had, the root beer we wore, as due to either the rough ride or the heat, the bottle exploded, spraying us all with the contents. The next thing I can clearly remember was our arrival in the Fairlawn section of Pawtucket. Along Power Road, right on Finch Avenue and into the driveway of Hash 177. What had so long been known to us as an address on our letters was a place of reality. There was a friendly old Airedale dog to welcome us at this new place of abode, a fine two-tenement house in a lovely locality. It seemed as if the kitchen alone was as large as Unwin Place. There was a large two-chest icebox, a large four-burner gas stove, a telephone, even an electricity. There was a dining room, parlour, bedrooms and a bathroom, even a cellar with an electric washer. Oh, how I loved that place. On the hot nights that summer, we sat out on the front porch, which in those days was referred to as the piazza. 26, if I could describe in broad terms this great change in my life, it would be as previously having lived and travelled through a rather confining though beautiful, safe and happy valley, which had now opened out into a broad expanse of more beautiful views and experiences of unlimited horizons just waiting to be explored. The explorations began in the first week, like roots of new plants waiting to come to life and mature in a new garden. I was puzzled by the sound of hundreds of whistles which continued incessantly through day and night. I wondered who was blowing them and where they were hiding. Little insects called crickets, I learned. Britain is strangely quiet by comparison, except for the hum of bees and the like. I remember little of Mom and Dad during the days of that first week. Jay assumed they were looking for work or had already found a job as plentiful in 1928. My first jaunt away from Finch Avenue was with Auntie, with whom we now lived until we could get a place of our own. We walked to the stores up Whedon Street. The thought of such a walk would shock an able-bodied person today, 3/4 of a mile each way. We often went to Zamperini's market. I'd never been in such a poshy grocery store. Across the street, I went for a haircut and met Tony the barber, not long here, from Italy, possibly in his early 20s, as handsome a young man as you would find anywhere. He was still at the same shop when I came here the second time in 1963, a grey-haired and tired old man he had now become. My first friends were Billy Gallagher, who lived across the street, and Lawson Wheeler, who lived in the upstairs floor of our tenement. Lawson was a veritable WC, Fields in miniature in his looks and worldly ways. If there was anything my parents never told me, and they never did, Lawson more than made up for. He was a tough egg, and Billy and his dog were more my constant companions. There were the Clark boys up the street who were the first to give me a lesson where trust was to be exercised. On the way over, I had bought a souvenir pin with a picture of the Laconia on it. On the day in question, we were gathered in a group when one kid squat behind me, unknown to me, while one of the Clark boys pushed me backwards. Naturally, I went down base over apex, coming up sobbing more from anger than pain. The other brother then came over, put an arm around my shoulder as I thought to comfort me. Doing so, he thus completed an evidently prearranged plan to steal my Laconia pin by removing it whilst his arm was around my shoulder. For the first time in my life, I had been played for a sucker. From that point on, I was more selective about my companions. At that time, Pawtucket was a bustling city, located on the falls of the Blackstone River, where the first cotton mill in America still stands, now the Slater Mill Museum. Textiles were the main industries in this area then, as in other areas of New England. There were 1 or 2 theatres along with movie houses, including the newly built Leroy, which sported the elegance of new cinemas of that era. I saw Al Jolson in my first talking picture there. Saturday nights there would be long lines waiting to get in for both early and late shows, television being yet unheard of. My first trip a down street as going downtown was known was on our first Saturday morning. We went in the Dart with Uncle and Auntie and Mom and Ivy. He dropped us off at the public market, then rode around until time to pick us up since parking places were hard to come by. There were no parking lots as yet, nor parking meters in 1928. I had never seen such a large indoor market. I was intrigued by the variety of goods available, but most of all by the glass showcases of meat with the coils of refrigerated pipes in the cases covered in white frost. The 27 butcher in England would have his meats on display in the shop window on a marble slab, the heat of day being no factor in the cooler climate of the old country. As a new arrival, I was not impressed with the pants the kids wore. They were what I would call plus twos. They had a belted top and the legs terminated just below the knee and were buckled there with straps over long stockings. I vowed I would never wear such monstrosities. I had arrived wearing the customary short pants of England. However, after a great deal of razzing from the other kids, I was soon happy to comply with the American standard of dress. It seemed you were considered to be a sissy if you wore short pants. My first Saturday in town with the gang was to be a visit to the music hall on Main Street. It was to be one of many. It sounded to be a grand place, so Mom made me dress up in my new pants, etc. The show was great. Gang and a western, maybe Tom Mix, Hoot Gibson, or some other famous cowboy. Upon leaving my seat at the end, I was shocked to find I had been sitting on a whopping big wad of gum someone had left on the seat. The music hall wasn't as grand as we anticipated, it seems, and I never again went dressed up. Notwithstanding all the good things I was enjoying, I had to come to earth at some point. That, as you might expect, was at the local school. I was duly registered and assigned a class and found the transition from English to American school not quite as terrifying as I had expected. The teachers were pleasant and for the time remaining until summer vacation not too great a burden. Looking back, there were so many new sights and experiences which I just seemed to accept naturally, as if it had always been so. The wooden houses, so colourful when compared to drab Yorkshire stone, were so different those first few weeks. The seemingly unending, beautiful, warm, sunny weather. The sound of the ice cream man's bell twice a day as he drove around. The communal cocoons of the brown tail moths which the men on the street would burn with torches before they could do their damage. There was Mr. Peterson, who lived up Finch Avenue, who wooed come around each day with his mobile fish van blowing on his trumpet-like horn to announce his arrival to the housewives on the street. There was the horse-drawn delivery van delivering milk, in bottles, no less. Each house had a card to put in the window to indicate to the iceman to deliver a block of ice. On each of the 4 edges of the card was printed a different price. If you wanted a 15-cent piece, you put the card in the window with the 15-cent edge on top. The iceman would then get his ice pick and chip a 15-cent piece off a larger block, grab it with his ice tongs and deliver it on his shoulder, putting it straight into the top compartment of your ice box. An enamel bowl was placed under the ice box, plastic not yet to be invented for several years, to catch the water from the melting ice. Ice boxes were quite effective, but inconvenient if you forgot to empty the bowl. I had never seen a cellar before with windows. English cellars had no lights or windows and were like dungeons full of cobwebs. Auntie's was light and airy, had a coal bunker, central heat furnace, workbench, and laundry tubs with hot and cold water. Here I saw my first electric vacuum cleaner. Never again would Mother get on her knees to hand-brush a carpet or hang a carpet on a clothesline at spring cleaning and beat the heck out of it with a cane beater. This was indeed the land of milk and honey. I was fascinated by the streetcars that had 4 wheel trucks under each end, unlike the double-decker 4-wheel English tramcars. The streetcars ran past the end of Finch Avenue 23, and sometimes we kids would get up to mischief after dark. The cars had a trolley at each end, fore and aft. The fore trolley would be pulled down from the overhead wire and retained under an inverted retainer hook on the roof. The aft trolley ran on the overhead wire and was attached by rope to a take-up spool on the rear of the car. The take-up spool being spring-loaded took up any slack in the rope caused by undulations of the overhead wire. While the car was paused at the end of the line near Finch Avenue, we would pull out some slack from the pulley and wrap it around the outer casing of the take-up spool. This prevented the spool from paying out rope when the car took the curve at Weedon Street, thus pulling the trolley from the overhead wire, stopping the car, putting out the lights and usually causing the motorman to blow his fuse when he had to go to the back of the car to free the trolley. When we arrived in 1928, we found ourselves in the midst of a presidential election campaign. Herbert Hoover and Al Smith were the main contenders, and all the kids wore a button backing one or the other. Since I wore one with a picture of Hoover on it, I must suppose Auntie and Uncle were Republicans. I didn't know the difference at the tender age of 8. The atmosphere of this new country seemed at once to be freer. easier going, exciting, and with each new experience, finding a logical acceptance in my mind. Although at this young age I was acutely and intensely aware of these new developments in my life, I was still only a very young boy with youthful interests, the usual mechanical toys, and games with the other boys and girls of the street on an evening. Later, the sand which had been dug out had to be loaded into Mack trucks and taken away. The Mack truck of those days was an ugly brute, chain-driven and solid rubber tyres. They looked like they were a tough machine. Edna was older than Jack and had a typewriter which we were allowed to use, and this was always a big attraction for me. Sometimes Jack and I would make our own darts out of household matches, paper and needles. Though they looked peculiar, they also looked cool. It seems that the annual holiday had been left behind in England, as we never had one during the next 6 years. It never seemed to me to be a necessity, as there were so many short trips. Oh, make it any time of the year. Life was... His job was to draw attention to this passing parade of life. Gas was 7 gallons for $1 then. Who was it who said, "Humour is the gadfly on the corpse of tragedy"? These were the roaring 20s, depression or not. Life went... Night games were not in the picture as yet. Neither were covered stadiums, artificial turf, batting helmets, nor coloured players. Though it may sound improbable, by the end of 1930, I would have appeared completely indigenous to my surroundings. Mom always said this was a legacy of the First World War and living so long in the trenches. As long as I had known him, he was subject to tonsillitis bouts on a regular basis. Various displays on the second floor contained Indian artifacts discovered within the camp area. In the 1930s, it was a relatively new camp, but it was rated about 3rd best in the country, and as far as I know ranks amongst the highest at present time. The organisation of the camp was fantastic. Outside the tent flaps were rolled and lashed, tent ropes all at an even tension. Each tent had a surrounding area to keep clean. We would brush it with a brush made of long twigs. Those tents and sites were a sight to behold when we... Each scout buddied up with one of his own colour and placed both tags on a hook on the tagboard in the appropriate colour section. No one was allowed in the water without a buddy to whom you stuck like glue. I didn't know it then, but I believe the seeds of good music enjoyment were planted in my mind, though I hated music lessons in school. One of my failing subjects, in fact. Naturally, I had made new friends, Bill Crosby and Al Thacker amongst others, but Bill 38 and Al in the main. It seemed to signal the beginning of the end of the Depression, as things started to pick up from that point on. 39, it was at Greystone I learned to play. When Bill had swung the engineer, a highball, okay to leave, he and the rear brakeman joined me. The slack ran out of the train, and with a jolt we were on our way. Bill explained the conductor's valve and other things, including toilet. Thus it was that in 1933 he left for the old country. The date that he left was at Camp Yorgoog, and I'm afraid my feelings for him were such that I did not write to say goodbye. The atmosphere improved at home after that, and life continued in a more pleasant vein. However, the gods had decreed I was to have one more adventure before that came to pass. In 1929, some very old and dear family friends sailed for Canada. Leaving Windhill near Shipley, they went out to settle. It was a practice up there for the fire department to flood saucer-shaped depressions on otherwise level land. This would freeze almost immediately to form a safe skating rink for the local people. As we arrived at our rink, a young boy was being taken away with a frostbitten foot. It meant that after our graduation trip and subsequent graduation in June 1934, my education would come to an abrupt halt. On arrival in England, I would have to get a job as soon as possible. Since I was never a good scholar, I welcomed the move from that standpoint. When the time was rung on the ship's bell on the bridge, the lookout would repeat it on the crow's nest bell. The bell was also used by the lookout primarily to warn the bridge when other ships were sighted. 1 stroke for a port sighting, 2 for starboard, and 3 for straight ahead. In the distance we could see the city of Liverpool, with the Royal Liver Building predominantly close to the Princess Dock. Well, my uncle had an aviary in the backyard with beautifully coloured budgies and a black dog called Don which followed us everywhere. I had 2 brothers. Jack was the eldest, with dark hair, and the other was a... Do you remember when I was a little girl hearing my dad offer these bits of wisdom? When you see a full moon, turn thee brass over. That meant you would have good luck. and he used a heavy Yorkshire accent when he said it. I also remember I was in great trouble as one night I came downstairs and bit all the heads off the pink spice pigs that hung on the tree. All the pigs on the Christmas tree were hung up by their bums. I could just reach them to have a good nibble. She was disgusted that her mother had done such a thing. In spite of all upsets which families have, Uncle Isaac was a really funny man, always joking and laughing, but always under his wife's watchful eye. Auntie Violet was a really nice aunt, very kind, but was crippled badly with arthritis of the hip, and if ever Uncle Isaac did anything wrong, she would shout, "Isaac Peel, I'm ashamed." The May Quechan was crowned by a boy who was chosen, wearing velvet clothes and large hat with a plume of feathers in it. We got 4 shillings for making a complete coat, 6 pence for a skirt, complete with a placket with press studs and hooks and eye. Oh, it was hard work, but I always wanted to bring home a good... Our Jack had a few different ones before his wife-to-be, Dorothy, came along. We all used to dance to old records at Mum's house. We wore the carpet out. We had a great dance place, Textile Hall, where they had the big bands. Jack went to Ruskin College with the scholarship he won. He did well, had about 3 homes in Bradford, was moved up in the trade union, and then was asked to join the Common Market, where he would move to Brussels, Belgium, own a lovely home, and make much money. Folks were outside. The photographer was taking pictures in the cold. Folks were throwing confetti at Stan and me. Then we went to the Coo Hall. A lovely place for a hot luncheon. We only had about 50 folks, just friends and family we loved, with whom to share them. He was so proud to push the pram home. We did not have much privacy, so we tried to go to the movies, sometimes just to be alone, but we always had a problem. Louise would awaken after we left, and he loved it. You could also have a sprinkling of raspberry vinegar on it if you wanted. He made the best. My dad would take Elaine by the hands and have her walk a few steps up and down Charnwood Road to help her get walking. Her hair was so blonde she nearly looked bald. We always had complaints. The water in the font was either too hot or too cold. But we did our best. This happened many Saturdays, so as you can see, it wasn't easy. My old dad used to say, I couldn't be paid to do a job like that. It seemed that we were always tired when we... Laverack, nice folks. We had such a happy time there, lots of laughs. Also, we did alterations. Nellie seemed to be always doing different things, as most of them would not do anything except sit and sew. I made coffee for the break, pinned up dress hems, overlocked, sewed, but it was In about October or November, I used to go to the little store called Johansson's and put 6 pence or a shilling there, which by Christmas added up, so I could buy the extras for Christmas Day dinner. You would be surprised at what I got for saving this. Also, when we went in the seawater, we put a plastic bag over the bandage and tied it up, so her fun wasn't spoiled at all. She had the stitches taken out of her wound by a Spanish doctor and was fine after that. It was fine after that, although it seemed to stay numb 64 where it was cut. We were so grateful to that man for his help, and for the fact that 65 she wasn't hurt. If Louise had not seen it happen, we may never have found her. We hugged our family, so thankful that all went well. We bathed the children and said, how we were truly blessed that all went. My mum and dad loved to sit out in the garden, as Stan had it so nice. Everyone was friendly and helped each other. That's how it should be. Thad forgotten to say my brother Jack married Dorothy Dobson and my brother Donald married Joan. Jack and Dorothy had 2 children, Vicky. Before we left, we had a letter from Stan's mum saying she really wasn't too happy in America, so she thought she would come home to stay with us. But Stan had already left. I had sold the house and was Ty, you have brought such joy and love into our lives. Great-Grandad would have loved you whenever you came to see us if was a hi. Great-Grandma, and you made us laugh always with your antics and cute smile. You were always a good boy with good manners. Adieu, you are a beautiful little girl.